So, you want to improve your magical damage, do you? Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Rayo, and welcome to my guide on magic rotations for FSOA and non-FSOA users. Before we get started, make sure to check the video description for the series playlist, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to get notified of new episode releases. Before we dive deep into this rotation guide, I wanted to mention that this video is a part of my overall series, Maniacal Magician. In our last episode, we obtained the Fractured Staff of Armadil, which brought us to this video today. So if you haven't seen that yet, make sure to check that out. Let's cut right into it. As mentioned in the intro, I'm going to go over a Fractured Staff of Armadil rotation and a non-Fractured Staff of Armadil rotation. And at the very end, I'll also include my full rotation cycle, which includes both of them combined. Keep in mind, I'm not the most top tier Magic player in RS3, but this general rotation has served me incredibly well so far and should put you on the right track should you be at a rotational loss. Let's start with the dual wield non-Fractured Staff of Armadil rotation. This section is going to assume that you have dual wield weapons and greater concentrated blast at the very least, and has two options: 4-tick auto attack, which I personally recommend and also requires a staff, and non-4-tick auto attacking, which works just fine as well. 4-ticking is essentially the same rotation you would do without 4-ticking, except you delay an ability by a tick in order to squeeze in an extra auto attack. The auto attack can easily do a few thousand damage, especially within Sunshine, so the trade-off is fairly big. A standard 4-ticking rotation in simple terms is this. Starting on your dual wield set, cast Greater Concentrated Blast, followed by a non-channeled ability, swap to your staff, then after your global cooldown finishes, noted by the white flash on all abilities on your action bar, use an auto attack and ability within the same tick. The only things that change are the two abilities in the rotation, the one following Greater Concentrated Blast and the one you pair with the auto attack. You aren't required to cast Greater Concentrated Blast in order for the rotation to work though. 4-ticking actually works anytime you cast a non-channeled ability with a dual wield weapon set. So for example, if I cast Combust with dual wield weapons equipped, I can still 4-tick from that. I just say this for the sake of understanding the mechanics of it and not making it seem like it's connected to Greater Concentrated Blast specifically. You really don't need to get that heavy with it, but Greater Concentrated Blast is one of your strongest basics for Magic, so that's why the general rotation starts out with it. Aside from it being in your favor to use it off cooldown essentially, starting it off in your 4-tick auto attack rotation helps you to mentally keep track of where you're at in the rotation. At least it does for me. Now, if you don't like the idea of 4-ticking, then that's fine as well. You can just do the same rotation without the auto attack included. I'm going to continue on with the full rotation. I'm not going to mention where to 4-tick here, but taking the prior explanation of it, you should be able to see where you can 4-tick and auto attack within your DPS rotation. As for the full rotation, here's what I've had work for me. Starting off on dual wield with Insight Fear active, you want to Sunshine, Adrenaline Potion, and build to 5 stacks of Insight Fear via Greater Concentrated Blast, Dragon Breath, and Corruption Blast. Follow that up with Tsunami, Greater Concentrated Blast, Wild Magic, Omnipower, Greater Concentrated Blast, Dragon Breath, Asphyxiate, and you can fill the gaps with Closet Gothic COF. Should you need Adrenaline, Tendrils is a very good option as each hit is a guaranteed critical strike, so under the effects of Tsunami, it will net you 25% Adrenaline, 40% from the critical strikes during its use, minus the 15% threshold cost. Should you go into a second Sunshine rotation off cooldown, you will still have your Adrenaline Potion on cooldown, so instead you can use Limitless if you have it available to rebuild Adrenaline after you use Tsunami in your rotation. So instead you can use Limitless into Tendrils if you have it available to rebuild Adrenaline after you use Tsunami in your rotation. Between Sunshine rotations, you just cycle through a standard Greater Concentrated Blast rotation, Greater Conc, Ability, Ability, Repeat, until Sunshine comes back off cooldown, to which you'll do the entire Sunshine rotation all over again. You can use thresholds during this time, but try to make sure that you have them back off cooldown when your Sunshine is ready to go. Before moving on, there are a few notes regarding 4-ticking. You can't 4-tick after a channeled ability. This is why we use a non-channeled ability after Greater Concentrated Blast. You also can't 4-tick after Tsunami or Omnipower. Not exactly sure why, but you just can't. Your non-channeled ability must be used with dual wield in order for this to work. The reason being is when you use a non-channeled ability with Magic, your currently equipped weapon speed is what's considered for your next auto attack, even if you swap weapons. We swap to a staff because the auto attack damage from staves is a lot higher than dual wield auto attacks, which is due to dual wield auto damage being split between both the main hand and the offhand. You also have to queue the auto attack yourself within the rotation. If you just use an ability after waiting 4 ticks, the auto attack won't fire out, so just make sure to press both the auto attack and your ability keybind at the same time. Lastly, the final ability in the rotation, the one that you queue with the auto attack, can be whatever ability, EOF spec, or weapon spec you want. The only ability that has limitations in this rotation is the ability prior to using the auto attack, which as we mentioned cannot be Omnipower, Tsunami, or any channeled ability. If you don't want to bother with 4 ticking, then that's fine as well. You can simply just ignore queuing the auto attack and play via casting abilities normally. But if you need an incentive to try it out, it's an 8% DPS increase give or take. And if you have the gear in your inventory to do it already, then it's the most free DPS increase you could incorporate into your rotation. For reference, Praisal Codices roughly offer a 2% DPS increase and it costs over 600 mil. So take that how you will. Now let's check out our FSOA rotation. There are a few different ways to set it up in different scenarios, but what I'm going over here should give you a decent understanding on how it works and how to set it up so that you can adjust it to the content that you're doing. For this section, it's assumed that you have FSOA, Armadyl Battlestaff EOF, and a Grimoire at the very least. The Grimoire doesn't affect the abilities you use per se, but the amount you crit definitely affects how many of your thresholds and EOFs you can queue. If you don't have a Grimoire, your results may vary greatly. To start off, make sure you're on Insight Fear with dual wield weapons equipped. You want to start off your rotation with Sunshine, Adrenaline Potion, then build up to 5 stacks of Insight Fear via Greater Concentrated Blast, Dragon Breath, and Corruption Blast. Then go into Tsunami, FSOA Spec, and Greater Concentrated Blast to build Adrenaline, and if you're not 50% Adrenaline by this point, use Dragon Breath or another non-bleed basic. After that, you want to swap to your staff and start with a Wild Magic, 2-hit Asphyxiate, Greater Concentrated Blast, Omnipower, Tendrils, then spam your Armadyl Battlestaff EOF to your heart's content, and use Wild Magic and Asphyxiate when they come back off cooldown. That's essentially the idea. You want to proc as many crits as possible while your FSOA spec and Tsunami buff are active simultaneously. But just as there are a few notes with the 4-tick auto attack rotation, there's also a few notes here to keep in mind as well. You want to camp your staff for everything aside from swapping to dual wield for Greater Concentrated Blast. 2H auto attacks are much stronger than 1H auto attacks, and the FSOA spec auto attack damage will calculate damage based on your currently equipped weapon set. Greater Concentrated Blast is still very strong despite requiring dual wield. The ability is not only strong in its own right, but the chance for critical strikes with it are incredibly high with a short cooldown. Over its 3 strikes, the second hit will have a 5% crit chance boost and the third hit will have a 10% boost. After the ability finishes, it will boost the crit chance of your next ability by 15%. This ability is also great for building Adrenaline while under the effects of your Tsunami buff. Now despite mentioning spam your Armadyl Battlestaff to your heart's content, this is very dependent on whether or not your ABS actually crits. With Vigor, ABS EOF costs 45% Adrenaline. Weaving in the occasional Greater Concentrated Blast between your ABS specs will help to add some consistency. But if ABS is critting, then spam it to the moon. And spamming your Armadyl Battlestaff is very fun, but don't neglect those thresholds. Wild Magic and a 2-hit Asphyxiate should ideally be used twice within your FSOA rotation. Now, let's talk about one of the most important notes on this list, the use of Limitless. Depending on the content you're doing, using Limitless Tendrils may be better to start your rotation with. In general, the Limitless Sigil and Adrenaline Potion serve a similar purpose in rotations. It'll allow you to access your threshold abilities quickly within your Berserk, Death Swiftness, and Sunshine rotations. For Magic though, Tendrils is incredibly strong under the FSOA spec and Tsunami buff. Tendrils has 4 hits, all of which are guaranteed critical strikes, which means each strike grants 10% Adrenaline due to the Tsunami buff and sends out an auto due to the FSOA spec. This is not only an incredible amount of damage, but the net Adrenaline gain from this is 36.2%. That's 51.2% Adrenaline gain assuming that you're using the Invigorating 4 perk minus the 15% threshold cost. This doesn't account for the fact that the auto attacks themselves can crit, which would give you another 12.8% Adrenaline from the auto attack sent out, 10% from the critical strike, and 2.8% from the base amount of Adrenaline gained from the auto attack itself with Invigorating 4. Tendrils itself will be used every single Sunshine rotation regardless, but the main thing to consider is the use of Limitless. Limitless allows immediate use of any thresholds for its duration assuming you have the Adrenaline to cast it, and it has a 90-second cooldown, whereas Adrenaline Potions can give you up to 40% Adrenaline at a 120-second cooldown. If you're doing short duration content that lasts less than a single sunshine rotation, or a boss encounter that doesn't have 2 complete rotation cycles back to back, then using an adrenaline potion and limitless on the opening rotation may not be a bad idea. In cases where you need consistency in your rotations though, staggering your limitless and adrenaline potions is what I'd personally opt to do. Lastly, let's end on a very helpful tip. Did you know that barrage spells autos hit faster than Incite Fear and Exsanguinate? I'm not exactly sure why, but that's how it works, which is great for auto attacks sent out by the FSOA spec. Aside from hitting your target almost immediately, you will be benefiting from the effects of your autocast as well. Barrage spells are scaled up to tier 99 damage, capped at your weapon tier of course, so a very nice autocast to use during the FSOA spec is Blood Barrage. The more you crit, the more you heal, and the amount you heal is borderline absurd and should be illegal in most countries. If you want to take it to the next level, you can even use the Dark Form curse to double its effect. Lastly, let's go into a full rotation cycle. This will be the rotation that I currently do, involving the FSOA rotation as well as the 4-tick auto attack rotation I mentioned at the beginning of this guide. Although I do 4-tick auto attack in general, I don't bother 4-ticking during the FSOA spec, but between my sunshines, I do. Another note to keep in mind is that the rotation varies depending on your adrenaline gain from crits. So this will be more of a list of prioritized abilities after FSOA spec as opposed to a solidified rotation, so take this all with a grain of salt. Let's go over that now. I start off with Sunshine, Adrenaline Potion, and build to 5 stacks of Incite Fear through Greater Concentrated Blast, Dragon Breath, then 4-tick into Corruption Blast, and swap to my Fractured Staff of Armadyl. I follow that up with Tsunami, FSOA spec, swap back to Dual Wield, Greater Concentrated Blast to build Adrenaline, swap back to Staff to Wild Magic, 2-hit Asphyxiate, Greater Concentrated Blast, Omni Power, Tendrils, then spam ABS until the FSOA buff wears off. Depending on the encounter, I will use Limitless after 2-hit Asphyxiate, otherwise I save it for my second Sunshine rotation. Depending on your adrenaline gain, you may need to Greater Concentrated Blast sooner than listed, or not at all. This rotation is probably the most consistent version I could come up with, but as I mentioned, it will vary depending on your adrenaline gain. After FSOA wears off, I begin my 4-tick auto attack rotation until Sunshine comes back off cooldown. I swap to Dual Wield, Greater Concentrated Blast, Ability, swap to Staff, auto attack and ability in the same tick after global cooldown, rinse and repeat. I fill the ability slots with basics, thresholds, and Claws of Guthic COFs, but my goal during this time is to maintain decent damage while upkeeping my adrenaline for my next Sunshine rotation. And that wraps up my Magic rotation guide. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm not the best Magic player in Runescape 3, but I have a decent understanding of how it functions, and you guys have been asking for a Magic rotation guide, so I wanted to put it together. If you missed my latest episode of Maniacal Magician, make sure to check that out. The playlist link is in the video description, along with the melee and ranged versions of this series. Speaking of melee and range, I've put together rotation guides for those styles as well, the links to which can also be found in the video description, along with links to my Discord and Twitch channel. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Rayo, and I'll see you in my next video. Take care.